Joined now by Dr. Michael Oren, former Israeli ambassador to the United States from his bomb shelter in Tel Aviv. Good morning, Dr. Oren. Welcome back. Good to see you again.
Hi, Hugh. Always good to see you.
I want to begin with
Go ahead.
a Ben Rhodes quote from yesterday. You may have seen it. Ben Rhodes writing yesterday, Israel has legitimate security concerns and has a right to go after the military wing of Hamas, a faction that has proven to be the worst version of itself. What do you think of that, Dr. Oren?
What's the worst version? What can I say? The Nazis were the worst version of themselves. I don't know what to make of that. It's like nonsense. And as if there's a military wing and a civilian wing of Hamas. Was there a civilian wing of the Nazi Party and a military wing of the Nazi Party? Let me get this straight. Let's not even go there. Can I tell you about my morning? I guess
Yes, please.
just tell me what a morning is like here. Okay, it's 1:30 in the afternoon here. This morning I've had three calls from families, either of people who have been captured or have been killed. The superintendent at my building called me to say that his best friend's son was taken out of a car by Hamas. They captured him and then they took him out and executed him. And they have photographs of it because these guys took photographs of everything. Then a woman called me who you may have seen the pictures of this young woman who was repeatedly raped and dragged through the streets of Gaza and spit on and beaten. Okay, all bloody,
Yes.
naked. Yeah, that young woman is the daughter of my daughter-in-law's doctor. And I spoke to the doctor this
Oh
morning.
my gosh.
I spoke to the family members of a young woman, 18-year-old woman, who was shot here to death. Her father was captured. The terrorists filmed it all and put it up on the family Facebook so they could all see it. Okay, you with me? As they say in New
Yeah.
Jersey. I just spoke to a former student of mine, a Yale student who's now writing for the press here, and she was invited to see the 45-minute video that the government is showing to select journalists, that footage taken from the head cams of the terrorists. And I don't know if she'll ever be the same. I don't even want to tell
Yeah,
you the things
Michael,
that she told.
I don't, I think we're in a 1936 to sort of 1938 unreality in the United States. They don't want to deal with it. I don't know if you ever read Eric Larson's book In the Garden of the Beasts, but the
I
Americans
did.
would go over to Berlin and they would clink glasses with Goering and Goebbels, and they never saw what was right in front of them. And there's a lot of Americans who do not see what's going on in this country, much less in Israel, with the rise of
No.
anti-Semitic marches and acts and violence. Aren't you? I don't even know
It's
how you.
deeper than that. It's deep, the acts of the violence is a deeper thing. It's like the tip of the iceberg. Because why? What's deep here? The deep is when that hospital got bombed. Okay, a triple lie went out. One, that Israel did it. Two, that it was a hospital. It wasn't. It was a parking lot. And three, that 500 Palestinians were killed, and it's not true. Okay, maybe we're saying maybe 100 at the most. Okay, not that's it's no great relief that 100 rather than 500, but the lie, and it was a triple lie, and everybody bought into it immediately. And what was the source? Hamas. Hamas. And Israel adduced all this evidence, hardcore evidence. The Pentagon adduced all this evidence, and Israel was still guilty. I mean, what is that if not medieval anti Semitism? What is that if not a bloodline?
Well, it is
What is
medieval anti-Semitism, and it's
murder of the
also
innocent?
an unwillingness to look at exactly what is in front of you. Lindsey Graham was in Israel yesterday, and he said, "This is
Yeah.
Iran." Former President Trump was in New Hampshire last night and said, "This is Iran." I say, "This is all Iran." It's all Iran. Do you think the world gets it yet? It's all Iran.
No, because you have to have total moral clarity by it. I listened to John Kirby's press conference yesterday. See, he said Iran, 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 but it's got to come out in a more clarion way. And we have been saying it's Iran, Iran, Iran for many years. And even as American bases are being bombed in the Middle East, right, being set to rocket and drone attacks, no one is entirely coming out and saying this is Iran and Iran is going to pay a price for this. No, they're saying it's Iran, but not Iran's going to pay a price. And I don't want to drag America into a war. I want people to say Israel's dragging America into the war, but believe me, if we don't stop them, they're going to be coming for you. We are the front lines here.
Well,
And
I've
I
got the Times
thoroughly
of Israel
believe
this
it.
morning. I've got the New York Times this morning. Apparently, quote, U.S. officials are telling Israel to beware. You don't want Fallujah 2004. You want to do Mosul 2017 from the comfort and safety of their D.C. think tanks and their Biden administration offices. It makes me crazy. They have no idea what Israel is dealing with. You can't afford to just sit back and bomb. You're mobilized, right? People don't understand what that means in Israel. What's it mean, Dr. Oren?
It's deeper. So I just finished an article for the Israeli press. It's going to be the front page of the largest paper tomorrow about the Mosul Fallujah comparison. Okay, it's all over the press this morning. And just for your readers or listeners who don't know what this is about, the battle for Fallujah in 2004 was a major battle. You know, the armed forces, U.S. armed forces, went in there. They crushed the city. They killed a lot of civilians. They killed a lot of terrorists. They lost a lot of men, but they got the city. They won. Mosul 2017 was against ISIS, and America had a different position. They sent in special forces, sort of surgical strikes, took out the ISIS leaders. It took a lot longer, but there were fewer casualties on the American side and fewer civilian casualties. So they're basically suggesting to us that we adopt the Mosul model and not the Fallujah model. And they don't understand. Not just the fact that, as you say, Hugh, that they're sitting back and in Potomac and sipping tea. It's not just that. They don't understand that when we call up 360,000 reservists and we don't use that force, okay, we will completely undermine the morale of our army. We've taken out a huge pistol. If we don't pull the trigger, it will make us look weaker than if we not had a pistol at all. A. Two, we cannot restore our deterrent power around the region. Cannot. No one will take us seriously. Three, not done yet. All right? We will not be able to secure our own borders. No, people won't live here, knowing that Hamas in some way gets away with it, even partially. And lastly, and this is a very Israeli thing, unless we actually go in and destroy Hamas with our army, we can't begin the process of healing. We've got a lot of healing to do here, in a sort of a breakdown between the covenant between
And
the
I
state
want to
and the
ask
people.
you, for our American audience who knows a little bit about Israel, it's a what would question, Michael Oren. What would David Ben-Gurion, what would Moshe Dayan, what would Golda Meir, what would Eric Sharon do right now in this situation? You're a historian. People should know. You've like won every book award there is in the world. You know this better than anyone. What would those four great leaders do right now?
Well, in the same article, I compared our current government to the government in 1967. And it's interesting. In 1967, the government waited for 3 weeks before launching a preemptive strike against the Egyptian Air Force, remember. And here we are entering the third week of waiting. So the comparison really just screams out. And in the end, keep in mind, Israel was not shot at in 1967. Israel fired the first shot, Hugh. And the debates, which I was able to research for my book on the 6 Day War, the debates were very clear. If we don't fire first, we will lose our deterrent power. All right. Everybody will understand that you can close the Straits of Tehran, you can blockade us, you can threaten us, and we're just going to sit here and take it. And that means we're dead. And it was very clear. I actually quote a line like that was spoken to the prime minister by the general staff. And it's the same things today. If a ceasefire, there's lots of talks of a ceasefire, understand this, is the death of the state of Israel. Death of the state. That means Hamas gets away with murdering 1,500 of our citizens. It means we go back to the status quo ante. It means Hezbollah internalizes that you can get away with this. It means Iran internalizes you can get away with this. It means the world knows that the world knows that nobody will stand with us and that we're not willing to defend ourselves. A ceasefire is that. So it's a very
So let me ask
similar
you,
situation.
what do you think Joe Biden is doing? What is Team Biden doing? Now, Ben Rhodes is not in the administration when he says it's legitimate to go after the military wing of Hamas, which is like saying it's legitimate to go after the SS, but not the Panzers and the Wehrmacht. It's just nuts. It's crazy. Don't carpet bomb Germany because, they're not, those are innocent civilians there in Germany. It's just crazy what Ben Rhodes thinks.
Or
But
it's
Karine
like saying after
Jean-Pierre,
Pearl
yes.
Harbor, Pearl Harbor happens, but let's make a ceasefire because the Japanese have a lot of prisoners, right?
Yes. So what is driving this? What do you think is driving this narrative in the United States that Israel has to restrain itself and Israel has to abide by the laws of war, which it has always and everywhere respected?
Well, you could probably go deeper. Listen, Hamas has created a real problem for the progressive left. Okay, because you're not supposed to have heroes that behead babies and rape women and burn people alive. It's hard to make these people into heroes. So it's a real challenge, and the people were really eager when the reports came out about the Israeli bomb the hospital, saying to themselves, "Well, hey, we can get out from under this moral problem of having been championed by these beasts, by these monsters." Um, and so they're always going to find a way to say, "Well, Israel basically had it coming to it." Okay, but behind that, deeply behind that, is anti-Semitism. Why? Because it's an old anti-Semitic trope that the Jews have it coming to us. It's original sin. In the medieval ages, if an innocent Jew was an oxymoron. All Jews were a priori guilty, and it's true here too. And even those people along the Gaza border, most of whom belonged to kibbutzim, who were very left wing and very committed to peace, they're guilty too. And so if the Jews are guilty, then Hamas is not that guilty now, is it? That Hamas had some kind of justification. It's very deep and very disturbing and extremely dark.
And Dr. Oren, let's close with this. There are at least a dozen countries with their citizens being held captive by Hamas. They're being held captive because they're Jewish. And I
Yes.
do not see the outrage in the world about this or the clarity. Is there anyone in the West who's standing tall and saying out loud, it's Iran and it's about destroying Israel? Because that's what it is.
Well, I think that the British have been good. The Italians have been good. The Meloni government has been good. You know, the president made some extraordinary statements. Extraordinary statements. The Secretary of State Blinken made some extraordinary statements. They've moved major military assets into this region, huge military assets into this region. The question is, they've pulled out again. I want to use this image of pulling out a big gun. They pulled out a big gun. If you don't pull the trigger, if you're not willing to pull the trigger, if people don't believe you're willing to pull the trigger, then it actually has a reverse. It has a worse effect of having not pulled out the gun at all, right? And so that's the big question.
I'm joined now by Dan Senor, whose previous book, of course, Startup Nation, was fabulous. His new book, coming out soon, The Genius of Israel, I'll be reading on the train to New York City today. And his podcast, Call Me Back, has become indispensable to me. Every day I listen to it. Dan, welcome back to the Hugh Hewitt Show.
Hey, Hugh, thanks for having me.
Dan, I want to begin with three things and have you respond to them as you wish. Number one, Karine Jean-Pierre yesterday took a question about anti-Semitism on the rise in the United States, turned it into an answer about Islamophobia. Eli Klein last night came home to his apartment in New York City and found a mob. I read from his Twitter feed. Just came home to hundreds of people outside my apartment here in New York City calling for intifada, which, given recent events, may well be considered a call for the mass murder of Jews. Never did I expect to see this kind of open anti-Semitism so close to home. And then third, Ben Rhodes, former Obama senior advisor and kind of the voice of Obama in exile, wrote in the New York Times, New York Review of Books, quote, Israel has legitimate security concerns and has a right to go after the military wing of Hamas, a faction that has proven to be the worst version of itself, close quote. I hope I'll hear you talk about that at length on Call Me Back. But what do you make of those three data points, Dan Senor?
The big overarching issue here, Hugh, and I find this so unsettling, so unnerving on so many levels. I'm the son of a Holocaust survivor. My mother's father was killed in Auschwitz. What we watched on October 7th be unleashed on Israel are echoes of the 1930s in terms of just wild, violent pogroms, just barbarism unleashed. The difference, Hugh, between the 1930s and the 1940s and today is the anti-Semites then, at least for their sake, tried to mask, tried to hide their atrocities. There was this whole movement years later, an quote-unquote academic movement called Holocaust denialism, which was an effort to play down what happened, to confuse some of the facts, to say, don't believe your lying eyes, this didn't happen. What I just described to you, Hugh, is different than what we are experiencing today. We are experiencing the barbarism, right? The beheadings, the live body burnings, the burnings of babies, the systematic rape, the torture, the hostage taking. So that we are seeing. But instead of trying to deny it or confuse it, they're not engaged in masking, and they're not engaged in Holocaust denialism. What they're doing is trying to legitimize it. It is the legitimization of the atrocities. It's not denying the atrocities. It's the legitimization of them. It is to say, well, yes, this violence happened, but please understand the root causes. Please understand what they are protesting against. Please understand why life is so difficult for the people who carried out these atrocities. Or in Ben Rhodes' case, please understand it is, some bad actors who are doing that, but they don't represent the entire entity of the political leadership of Hamas. So it is this effort at legitimization that is almost, I got to say, like I said, more jostling than denialism.
Dan, I am in the same position of being shocked. I have asked Dr. Oren this morning, and your conversation with him on Call Me Back was fabulous. I had him on this morning. If he had read In the Garden of the Beast, and he hadn't, by Eric Larson, it's about the American Diplomatic Corps in Berlin in the 30s. And they just didn't want to see what was right in front of them, Dan. And I don't know that Team Obama wants to see what's right in front of them. Ben Rhodes and the marchers in New York City and Karine Jean-Pierre, they don't want to see what's right in front of them.
Yeah, first of all, I'm glad you mentioned that Eric Larson book. It is one of my favorite books. It's really superb. I highly recommend it to anyone and everyone. Look, it's so bizarre and perplexing and maddening that it's hard to understand the logic behind what is going on here. But I'll just put it in these perhaps somewhat stark terms. All right, any civilized nation that on its border has an entity who in its charter is sworn to the destruction of your existence is one thing. But if that entity, when I say on your border, I mean on your border, right? Like a stone's throw away from communities, kibbutzim, neighborhoods, towns, right on the border, peaceful civilians living in these towns, stone's throw away from these monsters. If you have that kind of entity on your border with a charter committed to your eradication, and they have developed the means to try to eradicate you, and then it's not just a threat, they've actually tried to execute upon it in the most barbaric ways. There's no civilized nation on the planet that would say, we're going to learn to live with that. We're going to have a conversation with them. We want to understand what their concerns are. We're going to negotiate for a ceasefire. Any civilized nation would do what the U.S. did to ISIS over the course of 3 administrations, would do what the Allies did to the Nazis over the course of a few years in the late 30s and 1940s. I mean, any civilized society would just do what they had to do. And Israel, for some reason, yet again, is being held to a different standard. It's the yes but standard. Yes.
Well, Dr. Oren,
October 7th, but.
Dr. Oren said the deep issue here is anti-Semitism. The deep issue is that does Israel really need to exist? And the deep villain here is Iran, Dan. Now, I would like to ask you on Call Me Back, are you going to confront what the United States and the world has to do about Iran? They're part of the triangle of tyrants with Beijing and Putin, but they are particularly maligned because they're Islamist fanatics, and they have a theology that doesn't really mind the end of the world. Unlike Xi and Putin, they worry me. And we are letting them get very close to nuclear weapons. Can you imagine if Hamas had access to nuclear, even dirty bomb weaponry? What would have happened 17 days ago?
Yeah. So, look, I think there's no doubt that Iran was somehow involved with this. Whether they were actually coordinating minute to minute, we can debate. But there's no way Hamas would have the weapons and the funding and the self-confidence and the brazenness that it has or had without Tehran's, support, backing, orchestration. The same is true for Hezbollah in the north. The same is true for Palestinian Islamic Jihad, also in the Gaza Strip. So Iran is behind all of this one way or the other. And what worries me, and I am going to do an episode of this on my podcast on Call Me Back, is Iran the supreme leader of Iran is watching what's playing out right now. Israel getting itself mired in this fight in the south, potentially another front in the north. Be a pretty good time while the world is distracted with all of that for Iran to make its race to have a nuclear weapons capability, which we know they're close on. And they just need the Western world to kind of be distracted for a little while, and Israel to be distracted and potentially bogged down. So I actually think the timing is ideal for Iran. And yeah, I will be focusing on it. It scares the hell out of me.
Dan, let's talk about Call Me Back for a moment, because I have found it indispensable. For example, the episode this weekend on the laws of armed conflict. Fabulous.
Yeah.
I've been teaching glancingly in con law for years what is and is not the law of armed conflict, but proportionality is very poorly understood by the American Journalistic Corps. Now they have no excuse. What is the purpose of Call Me Back in these days?
Look, Hugh, I started my podcast during COVID, and it was dealing with a whole range of issues related from geopolitics to economics to U.S. politics. But I've always been involved in Israel. I have a lot of family in Israel. I've written extensively about Israel. I wrote one book about Israel, Startup Nation. As you mentioned, we have another book called The Genius of Israel that's coming out in the next couple of weeks, can be pre-ordered now, that deals in many respects with Israeli society rallying, the resilience of Israeli society that we're seeing now. And I have, I've deep ties. I've invested in Israeli startups. I have plenty of family and friends. I have 2 nephews that have been called up to the reserves right now in this upcoming fight that Israel's going to be in. I have a niece. My sister just sent me a photo this morning of one of our nieces she just sent me a photo of her back in uniform. She's been called up. I have cousins who've been called up. I have, I can go on and on. The co-author of Startup Nation and the co-author of The Genius of Israel, Saul Singer, who's my brother-in-law, his brother was killed on Israel's northern border as a paratrooper, killed by Hezbollah. So Israel is deep in my veins, deep in my heart. And I've done a lot of episodes over the years on Israel, although never focused on it like I am now. And when this war started on October 7th, on October 8th, I said one of my frustrations is people over here in the West don't really understand what's going on, and they need basic education, information. Some cases it's remedial, some cases it's more advanced, getting into the technical issues like the history of the Gaza Strip, the history of Hamas, the rules of international law and international war, like the episode with Matt Waxman that you just cited. What does the Gaza battlefront look like? What awaits Israel when they go into Gaza? And I figured I'm going to try to do an episode as much as I can, daily, 3 times a week, 4 times a week, 5 times a week, talking to Israelis that I know in my network. And so I'm trying to put one out almost every day or every other day just to help inform people.
It is so important for people to go and subscribe to Call Me Back if they want to be smart on this. Dan Senor, host of Call Me Back, author of The Genius of Israel, which you can pre-order. Keep coming back, Dan. Keep doing your work. It's a fabulous service. Call Me Back is must listening to podcasting.